What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 18 quarterback rankings for week 8 of the NFL season. I've already gone through the running backs, wide receivers, defenses, quarterbacks, and tight ends are today. I will say, even with no bye weeks, the quarterback position does feel a little bit rough. Lots of wide receiver injuries, just some quarterbacks who are maybe underproducing, so it makes it even more important to get this position correct. Let's dive right into tier 1 here, and this is pretty much just going to be like the Lamar Jackson tier. He has just been on a different level than any other fantasy quarterback, averaging 25.4 points per game. He's been super consistent, 23 plus points in 4 of his last 5 games. He's playing at a super high level. Even though this Browns matchup isn't great, I still think he's a cut above the rest at this point. I will say I do not have Jaden Daniels in these rankings. We don't know if he's going to play. If he does play, I would have him somewhere in tier 2, but that's why he's not in here if you're looking for him. Then looking at tier 2 here, we're going to start off with Jordan Love. Jordan Love has been super productive fantasy-wise. He's the quarterback 3 in points per game, and then he also draws a nice matchup here against the Jaguars. They've allowed the most fantasy points per game to the quarterback spot, so Jordan Love already producing. Now he gets that great matchup. I think he's a really nice play. Then I'm going to go with Josh Allen taking on the Seahawks. I think Josh Allen, he's been solid to start off the year. I think he's been better from a real-life perspective than fantasy-wise. He's had a couple games where they've been running the ball super well, hasn't had to do a ton through the air, but he's still been a nice fantasy option. Don't hate this matchup against the Seahawks. And then I do think he's going to be better rest of season with Amari Cooper really kind of working his way into this offense. I believe he only ran 12 routes last week, so should have a larger workload. The group of weapons here are kind of coming together. I think Josh Allen will be a quarterback 1, a high-end quarterback 1 moving forward. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jalen Hurts going up against the Bengals. Solid matchup. I know the Bengals defense has looked a little bit better in recent weeks, but they've still given up the 7th most points per game to the quarterback spot. Jalen Hurts, back-to-back games with 21 plus points. I think these guys are all nice options in tier 2. Now, tier 3 is actually just going to be a one-man tier. It's going to be Joe Burrow. In the games with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, he's averaging 22 fantasy points per game. I will say the last couple of weeks, the offense has looked a little bit flat. Eagles defense has been decent, especially in recent weeks, but it's also been against some weaker offenses, some weaker opponents. So I think Joe Burrow is kind of slightly behind those tier 2 guys, but I also think he's slightly ahead of the guys I'm going to go with in tier 4. Looking at that tier 4, going to start off this tier with Kyler Murray. And in a normal matchup, I would have him higher. I'd have him up there with a guy like Joe Burrow. But the Dolphins have just been a really rough matchup for opposing quarterbacks. They've allowed the fewest points per game to the quarterback position. The one thing I do think is decent here about this matchup is that typically, right, super good pass defenses, if you have a mobile quarterback, they can still produce because they don't need an insane amount of passing volume. I think Kyler's definitely one of those dudes. We know he has the ability to rip off a long run. He has 40 plus rushing yards in 5 of his 7 games. So I still think Kyler's a solid play, even though on paper the matchup looks really bad. Also in tier 4, going to go with Caleb Williams going up against the Commanders. I know he had some softer defenses in the last 2 games he played in, but 23.6 and 28.6 points in those matchups. Seems like he's really putting it together. I think coming off the bye week, this Bears offense should also make some improvements. And then a totally fine matchup here going up against the Commanders. After Caleb, going to go with Kirk Cousins going up against the Buccaneers. And Kirk really has not been all that great outside of one singular game, but I just really like the matchup here against the Bucs. And it is that game where he went out, threw for over 500 yards, 4 passing touchdowns. The Bucs have allowed the 2nd most points per game to the quarterback spot. So even though Kirk hasn't been super reliable, I do think this is a nice spot where he could have a big game. And then the final guy here in tier 4, it's going to be C.J. Stroud going up against the Colts. The Colts are top 10 in points per game allowed to the quarterback spot. I know he's not going to have Nico Collins, but I still think C.J. Stroud is a very good quarterback. He has Stephon Diggs. He has Tank Dell. And I do think we get a bounce back here. I mean, week 7 was miserable. Under 100 passing yards, 10 total completions. Like, that was absurd. I do think he's going to be better here. I mean, he needs to be better. I think he's going to be a lot better here in week 8. Now, looking at tier 5, definitely an interesting tier. I think these guys are playable, but maybe you don't overly love any of them. We're going to start off this year actually with Bo Nix going up against the Panthers. This is just a combination of him being pretty productive recently, 19.3 points per game in his last 3 games, and then this being a very favorable matchup. The Panthers have allowed the 4th most points per game to the quarterback spot. So Bo Nix starting to become fantasy relevant, has some rushing upside in there, and then with the nice matchup, I think he's a fine play. Then I'm going to go with Jared Goff taking on the Titans, and he's been super impressive in his last three, 23.7 points per game. My concern here against the Titans, first off, this is not a bad Titans defense. Like, they're a pretty decent unit, but the Lions are huge favorites, 10.5-point favorites. So double-digit favorites here for the Lions. This really just feels like a game script where it's going to be David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs racking up a ton of volume on the ground and just like running this Titans defense to death. That's what I'm kind of expecting here. Jared Goff only has one game above 30 pass attempts, which is crazy considering he's been like a pretty solid fantasy option. He's been ultra efficient, but that is the thing that I think is kind of holding him back from being a higher upside play. After Jared Goff, I'm going to go with Geno. Geno's kind of been the opposite in the sense that he's had a ton of volume. He is leading the NFL in pass attempts and yards. It's just that the touchdowns have not been there for him. Not a great matchup against the Bills. Could be without DK Metcalf, but I do think the volume can carry him here. Then I have Sam Darnold going up against the Rams. Really nothing crazy here, nothing crazy with this matchup. Sam Darnold's the quarterback 13 in points per game. Kind of just feel like this is where he settles in. Then I'm going to go with Tua to close out tier 5 here. I do expect him to make his return this week, and it's a return in a pretty solid matchup. The Cardinals have allowed the 5th most points per game to the quarterback spot. I do think there's reason to believe maybe Tua's a little bit rusty coming back, obviously missing 4 games with a concussion. The one thing that I think is kind of interesting about Tua is I do think obviously he has a lot of re-injury risk because if he suffers another concussion, I mean, he could be done for the year, could be done playing for good. But what's interesting about Tua is that he really does not play in a way that you would think would lead to concussions. Like, it's not like he's running around scrambling all over the place like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson. Like, he pretty much is a statue. It's just that like the one-off opportunity he gets hit or the one-off opportunity where he goes to run, then it's like the concussions happen. So in terms of his play style, I don't think he's going to see like a ton of regression. I don't think he's going to fall off because I don't think he's going to need to change a lot. Like, he's pretty much just been posted in the pocket. He's hitting Tyreek Hill. He's hitting Jalen Waddle. So from that perspective, I don't think there's going to be a huge adjustment period to him coming back, but obviously just missing the 4 games, there could be a little bit of rust there, but I still think with the matchup, he is playable. And then the final tier here, tier 6, I could also understand an argument for some guys not ranked, filling in here in tier 6. Going to go with Brock Purdy going up against the Cowboys. I will say we want to watch the injuries to guys like George Kittle, Juwan Jennings. If one or both of those guys are out, I would drop him here because he's already going to be without CMC, Debo, and Ayuk. That's tough, but this has been a pretty solid matchup. The Cowboys have allowed the 6th most points per game to the quarterback spot. Then I have Aaron Rodgers going up against the Patriots. Aaron Rodgers' best game of the season so far came against the Pats in week 3. I do think this offense is going to start to put it together. Do I think they're going to look amazing this week? Probably not based on what we saw in week 7, but I still think he's fine as like a mid to high end QB2. Then we have Dak Prescott going up against the Niners. This is kind of just where Dak has settled in. Quarterback 16 in points per game, coming off the bye week. I do think he's probably a little bit better than what he's shown and what this Cowboys offense has shown early on, but obviously tough to have a ton of confidence. And then I have Drake May. He's been super impressive from a real life and fantasy perspective through his first 2 starts, 19.5 and 20.8 fantasy points. This is just a tough matchup against the Jets. I know they looked rough against the Steelers, but they have still allowed the 5th fewest points per game to the quarterback position. And then I guess I just wanted to throw out a ton of names who, hypothetically could have slid in towards the bottom of these rankings. Baker Mayfield going up against the Falcons. I don't really know how to navigate this Baker situation because he was playing at a pretty high level. Obviously, fantasy-wise, he was a monster. But I mean, losing both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin is a massive hit to his value, in my opinion. I know he kind of lit up the Falcons last time, but throwing to Godwin, Evans with McMillan, Sterling Shepard, Palmer kind of filtering in as your wide receiver 3 is a lot different than having McMillan, Shepard, Palmer as your top 3 wide receivers. Like, that is a gross looking wide receiver unit. He still has Kate Otten, has some solid pass catchers out of the backfield, but with those weapons, I have a hard time getting excited about Baker Mayfield. Patrick Mahomes getting D-Hop. I don't think D-Hop's going to play a massive role here in week 8. It might seem crazy to not have Mahomes even in the top 18, but he truly has just been brutal for fantasy. He has not hit 18 points in a single matchup. Like, Drake May has the two, if you combine Drake May starts with Patrick Mahomes starts, Drake May has the two best performances, and he has started 2 single games. So it hasn't come together for Mahomes. Even in a decent matchup against the Raiders, like Mahomes has been bad fantasy wise in bad matchups, in like average matchups, and in good matchups. It just hasn't come together. So I really just can't rank him here in the top 18. I could see an argument for Jameis being an option here. Great matchup against the Ravens. Obviously, the supporting cast is pretty terrible, but he's going to go out there and sling it. Like Stafford, Russ, T-Law, all these guys could also, be in this range. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 18. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.